Have you ever imagined being alone in a vast expanse of sand and silence, and suddenly realizing you're not alone anymore? The midday sun burning your skin, the dry sound of hooves echoing on the arid ground, and in the distance, figures emerging on the horizon. At first, they seem like nothing more than distant shadows, but with every step, every second, they reveal themselves as native warriors, mounted, armed, advancing in your direction. Your heart races, your breathing shortens, you're far from any town with no witnesses, no help, and the only thing you're sure of is that you're completely at their mercy. What would you do? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. That morning, the cowboy set out with a simple goal: to reach the border before nightfall. The sharp wind carried the scent of dry earth and the dust stirred up by his own horse. He knew every twist of that route, or at least he thought he did, but the Old West has its own rules, and often those rules aren't made by men but by fate. He had no idea that in just a few hours, he would go from being the hunter to becoming the hunted. The first signs were almost imperceptible: a quick blur behind a rock, a rustling sound that made his horse uneasy, and that uncomfortable feeling of being watched. As he rounded a small rise, there was no more doubt. There they were, at least a dozen, positioned as if they'd been waiting for him. No sound, no shout, just hard stares like sharpened blades. The cowboy had heard stories of other men who crossed paths with hostile tribes and never returned, and in that moment, every tale he'd ever heard seemed to come to life before his eyes. Even so, there was nowhere to run. Changing course would be suicide, and confronting them impossible. So he did the only thing he could. He kept his gaze steady and let them approach. That's when he noticed something strange. Instead of surrounding him aggressively, the warriors positioned themselves around him, forming a kind of silent escort. There was no attempt to disarm him, no order to dismount, just a signal from the leader to move forward. But why? With every yard they traveled, the tension grew. Were they taking him as a prisoner, planning to hand him over to some enemy, or was there something more behind that enigmatic behavior? As they rode side by side, the cowboy noticed the details: the way one of them kept his hand near his waist, as if protecting something; another constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting danger from outside. These were signs that didn't match the idea of a capture, and that, instead of bringing relief, only made everything more confusing. Have you ever felt that? That sense that everything points in one direction, but the small details seem to tell another story. It's in that fine line between fear and curiosity where the biggest plot twists happen. The cowboy sensed he was part of a game whose rules he didn't yet understand. And in the Old West, not knowing the rules could mean the difference between making it home or never being seen again. The sun began to slowly descend, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. The border was near, but the mystery only deepened. What did those Indians really want with him? And why, even without understanding, did part of him start to feel that maybe he was safer there, surrounded by warriors, than alone in the desert? And it's precisely at that moment, when the truth seemed on the verge of being revealed, that something happened and completely changed the course of that escort. The sound of hooves echoed on the dry ground, and each step seemed to carry more questions than answers. The cowboy, even while keeping a close eye on the warrior's every move, couldn't stop his mind from filling with old memories and fears. This wasn't just a journey to the border. It felt like crossing an invisible threshold where trust and suspicion walked side by side. And this is exactly where I want to invite you to step deeper into this story. If this scene makes sense to you, if you've ever gone through something that started filled with uncertainty and ended up revealing something much greater, drop in the comments what touched you the most so far. Every shared experience builds a bridge between us and helps others see themselves in these narratives. Your engagement here is what helps this channel grow and reach more people with stories like this. When you leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe, it's not just a gesture of support. It's like throwing another log on the fire to keep the flame burning. That's what keeps our community alive, allowing me to bring even more emotional and meaningful stories from the Old West. So if this journey has moved you in any way, go ahead and hit that like button now, subscribe, and come be a part of this ride with me. Because with every new video, the road goes on, and you never know what kind of encounter might change a destiny forever. And as the dust kicked up by the horses danced in the air, something on the horizon began to move, a sign the cowboy couldn't ignore. Before that day, that would change everything. The cowboy already carried a weight few knew about. It wasn't just the exhaustion from long journeys, or the dust clinging to his skin after crossing mile after mile of hostile territory. It was the silent weight of choices, losses, and promises made on cold nights while staring up at the open desert sky. He wasn't a legendary hero, nor someone driven by gold or glory. He was an ordinary man, but forged by the need to survive in a world where the law arrived too late, and justice was often just a score settled between rivals. His life before that encounter was marked by a personal code: never turn your back on someone in need, and never back down from what's right, even if the cost is high. That mindset was born early, back when he was just a boy who had to leave his family to work. On distant ranches, learning to read not from books but from the eyes of people hiding secrets and the calloused hands of those who never gave up. He knew that in the Old West, every decision shaped not just the present, but the entire future. And maybe it was that awareness that made him more attuned to signs, even the ones invisible to others. On that particular journey, his mission seemed simple on the surface, but it was loaded with meaning. Crossing the border wasn't just about changing territory. It was about delivering a message that could seal an agreement and prevent an impending conflict. Behind the scenes of that journey, there was political tension, land disputes, and old stories of bloodshed. He knew the risks well. He knew that every step could lead him into ambushes, betrayals, or situations where the hidden truth would only reveal itself too late. But what no one knew was that behind that mission, there was also a personal reason, something that drove him forward. Even when thirst scorched his throat and his body begged for rest, it wasn't just duty, it was a kind of silent promise he refused to break. And this is where the transformation few notice begins. The external journey, with all its dangers and uncertainties, was also a reflection of an inner journey, where he faced memories, guilt, and choices that had shaped him up to that point. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because understanding who he was before the encounter with the native warriors is essential to grasping the impact that day would have. The cowboy had learned over the years that the West doesn't forgive naivety. Silence can hide as much danger as a drawn gun. He trusted his own instincts, but he also knew that life had a habit of testing convictions at the most unlikely moments. As he rode that morning, his thoughts merged with the rhythmic sound of hooves. He remembered old conversations with older men who spoke of how true strength wasn't just in a steady aim, but in knowing when not to pull the trigger. That kind of wisdom, often ignored by younger men, was what guided him. He didn't seek out conflict. He sought to fulfill his mission and make it out alive, but he also knew that fate rarely respects even the best-laid plans. The heat was rising, the landscape repeating itself in shades of brown and gold, and he felt that something was about to change. He didn't know whether it would be a threat or a revelation, but that familiar feeling returned. The road was about to test him again, and as always he was ready to face it even if he didn't have all the answers. The wind blew in dry gusts, kicking up small clouds of dust that spun in the air as if dancing on their own. The cowboy pressed on, his eyes fixed on the horizon, when a strange sensation came over him, a silent weight, as if something invisible was on the verge of revealing itself. The sound of his horse's hooves, once comforting, now seemed too loud in the emptiness. He knew that in the Old West, silence was never just silence. Often it was the prelude to something that could change the course of a journey. That's when he saw them, small figures beginning to take shape on the distant line where sky met earth. At first, he thought it was a mirage, those shimmering waves of heat that fool even the sharpest travelers. But as he drew closer, the outlines sharpened. Riders, warriors. The feathers atop their heads swayed in the wind, their war paint stark against their skin, and each one looked like he carried not just weapons but stories etched in battle and survival. The cowboy's heart quickened, not from panic, but from heightened awareness. Every muscle in his body braced itself, though he knew no reaction would be fast enough if things turned hostile. He counted the figures in his head. 8, 10, maybe more. The horses moved with measured steps, their eyes locked on him like blades aimed straight at his chest. The distance closed, and the tension filled the space like an invisible weight. No shouts, no overt threats, just the steady beat of hooves on dry ground, a cadence so hypnotic it made time stretch out. The cowboy felt the heat rise beneath his hat, not just from the merciless sun, but from the awareness that he stood alone before a group that could decide his fate in seconds. Then something caught his attention. The warriors didn't fan out to surround him as he expected. Instead, they formed an oddly symmetrical formation, leaving a space in the middle, as if they were opening a path, not blocking one. The leader, a man with an imposing posture and a deep, unflinching gaze, kept his eyes locked on the cowboy, not breaking contact for even a moment. The cowboy gripped the reins tightly, resisting the urge to shift direction. In the West, any sudden move could be seen as a threat. He took a deep breath, trying to read the moment. There, in front of those stern, expressionless faces, he knew this wasn't just about physical force, it was a mental standoff, a test of will and intent with no words exchanged. Now I want to go even deeper, because that moment wasn't just about two worlds meeting in the middle of the desert. It was about how split-second decisions can shape an entire journey. There was a hidden truth in the way those men moved. They weren't there by chance, and this meeting was no accident. The precision of their steps, the total silence, and the way they controlled the rhythm said far more than any verbal threat ever could. The cowboy felt he was standing before something far beyond the simple idea of being captured or spared. It was as if he were being observed not just as a man, but as a symbol. He wondered whether his reputation had preceded him, or if this moment was part of a much larger plan, drawn up behind the scenes of alliances and conflicts he barely knew about. And as the warriors came close enough for him to see the reflection of the sky in their eyes, a mixture of respect and distrust began to form within him, because deep down he knew encounters like this don't happen twice in a lifetime, and every detail carries a message that only becomes clear much later. The first gesture came from the leader. He raised his right hand, not as one who commands a stop, but as one who sets the pace. The cowboy, without changing his posture, slightly slowed his horse. It was a simple movement, but rich with meaning. Neither side wanted to show haste, and every second of eye contact felt like a silent test of trust and endurance. The other warriors kept their eyes locked on him, some gripping their reins tightly, others subtly adjusting their weapons. There was no overt threat, but no room to let his guard down either. The cowboy knew that in the Old West, most of what's said never leaves the mouth. He focused on the tiniest details, the way one warrior glanced back to check if the rear was secure, the faint sound of an arrow being gently repositioned in a quiver, the careful way they held formation, as if any deviation might compromise the mission. These gestures, seemingly trivial, revealed discipline and strategy. They weren't lone hunters. They were part of something larger, coordinated, with clear objectives. The air was heavy, and the sense of being evaluated was almost physical. The cowboy kept his face neutral, but inside, every instinct screamed for him to read the situation with precision. One wrong move could ignite an invisible fuse. He didn't know if he was facing protectors, enemies, or mere observers, but he knew that one way or another, he stood at the center of a decision that wasn't his to make. Sometimes the mind works faster than the body, and in that moment, he recalled old stories told by travelers who had survived encounters like this. Some said the natives could read a man's intent by the way he held his reins, or by the look he kept in the face of danger. Others claimed that prolonged silence was a way of measuring courage. Those who rushed to speak were the first to betray. The cowboy chose to remain silent, letting his presence do the talking. With each passing minute, it became clearer that this wasn't an ambush. The warriors didn't crowd him, but neither did they fall back. They maintained a steady distance, as if forming an invisible corridor to guide him. The sound of hooves on the ground, mixed with the rustling of feathers and the occasional jingle of metal ornaments, created a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. It was as if this escort had a purpose greater than simply leading him from one point to another. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what the cowboy was experiencing in that moment went far beyond geography or cultural differences. It was a test of mindset. In the Old West, true strength wasn't just in the speed of your draw, but in your ability to control your instincts. And he knew that's exactly what he was being watched for, how he handled uncertainty, how he balanced vigilance with respect, how he read between the lines of a situation that seemed simple but carried layers of intent. The hidden truth behind those watchful eyes was that sometimes you don't choose the journey chooses you. And when that happens, every gesture matters, because it's not just your life on the line, but how you'll be remembered after the dust settles. The path stretched ahead of them like an endless ribbon, winding between low hills and dry stretches of open plain. The merciless sun cast long shadows of the horses onto the cracked earth, while the dry wind carried the faint rustle of heat-withered plants. The cowboy rode at the center of that silent formation, feeling the cadence of hooves matching the beat of his own heart. With each step, he realized this wasn't just an escort. It was almost a ritual, an unchoreographed dance that moved with perfect rhythm. The heat bore down, and sweat trickled down the back of his neck. But what stood out most were the subtle details that didn't align with the image of a hostile group. One of the warriors discreetly cleared stones from the trail so the cowboy's horse wouldn't stumble. Another, at one point, offered a canteen of water without a word, just a firm, respectful gesture. These small acts planted a growing doubt. If they meant harm, why show care? The scenery slowly shifted. On one side, a deep valley with red rock walls that shimmered under the sun. On the other, dry fields where only solitary cacti stood their ground. With each new turn, the cowboy watched the warrior's posture, alert, scanning the horizon, as if expecting something that had yet to reveal itself. They didn't seem focused on guarding him against escape. They seemed instead to be protecting him from something else, something he might not yet know existed in that region. As the hours passed, the initial tension began to shift into a more measured sense of alertness. The cowboy no longer saw only potential enemies, but men who bore stories in their bodies and in their eyes as complex as his own. He realized that, like him, each of them had their own reasons for being on this path, and that realization awakened a quiet respect, not just for those escorting him, but for what the moment itself represented. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because that journey to the border wasn't just a physical passage. It was a test of mindset, of seeing beyond first impressions and grasping the hidden truth that exists behind the scenes of the most unlikely situations. In the West, a gesture of kindness might mean protection, but it might also be a strategy to earn trust. Likewise, silence could signal indifference or deep respect. The cowboy knew he stood at an invisible crossroads. He could keep feeding fear and distrust, or make room to interpret those signs in a different way. That decision, quiet and deeply personal, was as significant as any duel or ambush he'd ever faced. Because true transformation doesn't only come from great events, but from moments like this, long, silent, and full of hidden meanings. And as the sun began to dip in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and orange, the cowboy realized the border was no longer just a spot on the map. It was a symbol. Reaching it, surrounded by these men, meant more than completing a mission. It meant crossing an inner landscape where old fears gave way to new ways of seeing the world. It was in the midst of that quiet march that the first subtle signs began to stand out, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. The cowboy, trained to read the world through its details, noticed one of the warriors quietly moving ahead to scare off a coyote that had been prowling up the trail, before the animal even became a threat. No alarm, no words exchanged, just the swift, precise action of someone who knew protecting the group came first. Minutes later, another sign. The cowboy's horse stumbled, slightly on a loose rock, and before he could steady the animal, one of the natives had already dismounted to remove not only that rock, but several others along the path. Again, not a single challenging glance or show of dominance, just practical, silent action from someone who understood the value of a safe journey. These gestures, though subtle, planted an unsettling question. Were they acting as guardians, or simply as watchers who, for some reason, needed to keep him unharmed? The sun kept bearing down, and that's when the escort leader approached, offering him a canteen of water. He said nothing, just gave a slight nod, almost a greeting. The cowboy accepted, and for a moment he felt that exchange carried more than just the quenching of thirst. It was a silent code of respect between men who knew the harshness of the trail. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what was happening here wasn't just about small acts of kindness. In the Old West, every movement carries weight, Every decision is measured, and even the smallest act can completely shift the perception of a situation. These signs were like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together before the cowboy's eyes. He knew that if he wanted to understand the hidden truth behind this journey, he would have to assemble those pieces slowly, watching not just what was done, but also what was carefully avoided. And there was something deeply intriguing about it all. None of the warriors seemed to be acting in a way that tried to explicitly earn his trust, as if they were trying to prove something. On the contrary, their actions were so natural, so fluid, they gave the impression that this care had been part of a protocol long before he ever arrived. That naturalness is what made everything even more mysterious. If they weren't trying to win his trust, then why show such deliberate attention at all? The cowboy felt he was standing in the middle of a paradox. Everything suggested he was safe, yet nothing explained why. And that blend of security and uncertainty stirred something in his mindset, forcing him to reassess his initial assumptions. It was like walking a trail that seemed calm on the surface, but deep down, you knew could hide something unexpected at any moment. The landscape began to shift as the afternoon wore on. The flat, dry ground gave way to a series of low hills with patches of denser vegetation and a narrow river cutting across the path ahead. The cowboy, worn out from the long journey, could feel the weight of every mile in his bones. But curiously, it wasn't the physical fatigue that weighed on him most. It was the gnawing unease of not knowing the true purpose behind this silent escort. The border was near. He could feel it. The smell in the air had changed. The breeze grew cooler, drifting down from the mountains, and even the warriors' behavior signaled they were nearing their destination. Then something shifted in the formation. The leader, who until that point had kept slightly ahead or to the side, slowed his pace and moved closer to the cowboy. His eyes, dark and deep like a moonless night, locked onto his for several seconds before a word was spoken. The group kept moving, but all attention seemed to focus on the exchange that was about to unfold. Without urgency, the leader pointed to the horizon, where a small village lay hidden among the trees. His voice, deep and deliberate, broke the heavy silence. They weren't there to take him prisoner, nor to stop him from crossing. In fact, they were escorting him to ensure he made it alive. In recent weeks, ambushes had become common in that region, carried out not by any tribe, but by rogue groups preying on lone travelers, often using the natives' names to spread fear. The cowboy felt a rush of relief and surprise. The narrative he had been building in his mind from the moment he first spotted those men unraveled in an instant. They weren't the threat. They were the invisible shield that had kept him safe the entire way. But there was more. The leader revealed that word of the cowboy's journey had reached them through an anonymous messenger, and that the order to protect him came from someone the cowboy hadn't expected to hear from. A name that made his chest tighten, like being struck by a blow you never saw coming. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because that revelation wasn't just about physical safety. It was about the impact a decision made by someone behind the scenes can have on another person's life. The cowboy began to realize that his once solitary journey was now tangled with other stories and interests he didn't yet fully understand. It was like reading a book and suddenly discovering that the missing pages had already been written by hands he didn't recognize. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would be seen the same way. The protection he'd mistaken for surveillance, the distance he'd read as coldness, even the silence that had unsettled him. Everything now took on a new meaning, and as with every true transformation, this shift in perspective didn't come with neat answers. It came with a storm of new questions. The impact of the revelation struck the cowboy almost physically. It was as if all the weight of suspicion he'd carried throughout the journey had been ripped away at once, leaving behind a void, not an uncomfortable one, but a space ready to be filled with something new. He took a deep breath, feeling the air enter more freely, as if his body itself recognized it no longer needed to remain in constant tension. The image he had built of the warriors, shaped by old stories and inherited prejudices, dissolved in the clarity of that moment. The cowboy wasn't a man of easy words. Life had taught him that speaking less and observing more was almost always the better strategy. But in that instant, he felt an almost urgent need to express something, even if only with a glance. And that's what he did. He looked directly at the leader of the escort and gave a small nod of his head, heavy with respect. It wasn't a casual gesture. In the Old West, that kind of nod meant something. It was a quiet recognition of honor and significance. As they continued onward, he began to reflect on how mindsets are often shaped by indirect experience. For years, he had heard stories of conflict, ambush, and betrayal involving native tribes. He had never stopped to consider that, in many of those tales, the hidden truth might have been far removed from what was shared over saloon tables or around campfires. The revelation that day didn't just save his life. It dismantled an entire worldview he'd been carrying up to that point. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because the transformation the cowboy was undergoing wasn't just about recognizing an act of protection. It was about learning that honor can emerge in the most unlikely places, that decisions made by others behind the scenes can radically alter the course of a life, and that gratitude is one of the few feelings capable of breaking through invisible barriers. He realized that by accepting help without resistance, he was also allowing a bridge to be built between worlds that had historically avoided each other. That experience forced him to confront his own vulnerability. At first, he believed he was in control, making choices, assessing risks based on his own judgment. But now he saw that, from the very first encounter, unseen forces had been moving quietly to ensure he reached his destination. And that stirred something deep within him, the understanding that we don't get far by strength alone, but also by the outstretched hand of someone who, even as a stranger, chooses to walk beside us. The village ahead looked like any he'd seen before. Simple wooden homes, smoke rising from chimneys, a few horses tied up at the central watering trough. But to him, nothing was the same. That arrival carried the weight of a lived story, and its meaning would never be lost. As he crossed the border, the cowboy felt that something inside him had changed irreversibly. It wasn't just the relief of reaching his destination safely. It was the awareness that the journey had been so much more than a physical crossing. Every step, every silent glance, every unexpected act of care had left a mark, dissolving old certainties and opening space for a deeper understanding of the world around him. He realized that for years, he'd seen the natives through a foggy lens, shaped by second-hand stories, almost always laced with fear and mistrust. But now, with the experience etched into his own skin, he understood that the reality was far more complex, and at the same time, more human. The days spent alongside those warriors hadn't just changed his opinion of them, they had changed his view of himself. The transformation he was living through was internal, silent but powerful. Once, he had seen every encounter as a clash of territories or interests. Now, he understood that there are invisible alliances that only reveal themselves when we're willing to set aside prejudice and pay attention to the signs life lays out on the trail. It was as if he had taken off a blindfold he hadn't even known he was wearing. This shift in mindset didn't come with speeches or grand explanations. It came from practical example, from genuine care, from quick decisions made to protect him without him ever having to ask. It was impossible not to reflect on the impact that would have on his own conduct moving forward. If even those who could have chosen to ignore him decided to help, why couldn't he carry that same posture toward those who crossed his path? Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this experience also revealed something about his own vulnerability. Deep down, the cowboy had always believed that his skill, his courage, and his determination were enough to get him through any situation. But on that journey, he realized there are moments when a man's strength isn't found in walking alone, but in accepting the hand that reaches out to him. And accepting that help didn't make him weak. On the contrary, it made him more whole. Looking back, seeing the warriors now slowly fading into the distance, he felt a mix of gratitude and humility. He knew he'd never forget those faces, not because they were tied to a moment of danger, but because they marked the breaking of a barrier he hadn't even known he was carrying. He learned that true respect is born from understanding, and that often the hidden truth only reveals itself when we stop rushing to judge. As he headed toward the village, the sound of hoofbeats fading in the distance, the cowboy carried more than just memories. He carried a new way of seeing people in the world, a lesson not written on any map, but one that would guide his future decisions with the precision of a well-calibrated compass. He paused for a moment before entering the village, allowing the moment to imprint itself on his memory in full detail. The wind carried the scent of smoke, mixed with the distant aroma of bread baking, and for the first time in days, he felt completely at peace. The world out there was still the same, with its disputes, uncertainties, and dangers, but something inside him had changed. That escort, which had once carried the weight of fear, had become living proof that perception can deceive, and that sometimes what we judge as a threat might actually be saving us. Cowboy had always believed the road was a place where only the strongest survive, but now he understood that strength wasn't just about enduring alone. It was about recognizing the value of a hand extended, even if that hand came from someone you never expected to trust. This change in mindset wasn't just a lesson for future travels. It was a permanent reminder that snap judgments based on appearances can steer us away from something that might protect us. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what happened there wasn't just a physical passage, it was a silent transformation. It's behind the scenes of the most challenging journeys that we begin to understand the importance of reassessing our certainties. There's a hidden truth that only reveals itself when we look beyond the obvious. Intentions are often not stamped in the most visible actions, but tucked away in the smallest of gestures. The problem is, most people live unaware of these signs, too busy reacting quickly to protect themselves, not realizing that true protection might lie exactly in what once seemed like a threat. He knew that from now on, every time he found himself in a dangerous situation, he would remember this day. He'd remember the steady eyes, the calculated silence, the constant presence of those men who, without words, had ensured his life. And he would carry with him the certainty that courage isn't just about facing danger, but also about accepting that the greatest allies sometimes come, disguised as threats. That phrase echoed in him like both a warning and a truth. Sometimes the greatest allies appear disguised as threats. As he made his way toward the village, the distant sound of the escort's hoofbeats still echoed in his mind, not as a sound of surveillance, but as a reminder that the most unlikely connections can form when we least expect them. And on that day, he understood that every encounter holds the potential to forever change the way we see the world and the people we meet along the way. If you've made it this far, then I think you already know this story wasn't just about a cowboy and a mysterious escort. It was about how life sometimes teaches us through paths we wouldn't have chosen ourselves. That's why I want to ask you for one simple thing. If this message made sense to you, drop the phrase, "I'm with you till the end" in the comments. That way, I'll know you walked this journey with me all the way to the last step. While you're here, go ahead and hit the like button. That's how I know it's worth continuing to bring you stories that touch, transform, and make us see the world with new eyes. And if you're not part of this community yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to show your support and ensure we keep sharing these journeys together, always with something new to learn along the way. And since you're here, there's another story right next to this one that will move you just as much, maybe even more. Click and keep walking this road with me. There's still so much more to discover,